Hello, my name is Philip Meriton, and today we're going to have a conversation beyond science and religion.
Breaking new ground in thinking, exploring the outer limits of what we know about the world and ourselves, unhindered by common beliefs and perceptions. This is Conversations Beyond Science and Religion, taking on subjects from the Big Bang, the multiverse, and evolution, to the supernatural and the new rising consciousness. This is where scientists, philosophers, New Agers, and spiritualists come together to discuss where this world may be heading. Now, here's your host, lawyer, philosopher, and the author of The Heaven at the End of Science, Philip Meriton.
Now, today we're going to move to the practical sphere and talk about a topic we all know and love, and that is food. But this is food with a twist. The issue here is that many of us eat too much and the wrong kinds of food, and we know where this leads and is leading, and that is obesity. It's hard to ignore the fact that recent statistics show that over one-third of American adults are obese, and of course this is not a good thing. And this problem has attracted the attention of a lot of people, from Michelle Obama with her program to reduce childhood obesity by 2.5% by 2015, to the New York Mayor Bloomberg, who you may have heard has led the passage of a law banning the sale of large sugary drinks by restaurants and street vendors in the city of New York. And the statistics are really overwhelming, and you can go anywhere and check out some of these statistics, but one or two that have caught my attention is that the U.S. Armed Forces warns that 1 in 4 Americans aged 17 to 24 is too heavy for military service. I don't think that was the case in the 1930s and 1940s, before World War II, by the way. The number of children eating a healthy diet, as measured by the USDA Health Eating Index, is also way out of kilter. A score of 80 out of 100 indicates a healthy diet. Today's score is 55. So 55 out of 100 kids are eating a healthy diet, and there's certain goals to reduce that. So we have an obesity problem, we have a food problem in this country. Another theme in this show has been the topic of consciousness, and we talk a lot about the connection between consciousness and the world, and consciousness and our bodies. And we've had a lot of great guests in this show who have delved into these topics. A related issue is the rise in consciousness. Are we heading to a place where we have a greater awareness of ourselves and who we are? And we've talked to such people as Greg Braden and Amaka Swami, who believe, like many others, including me, that indeed we are on this upward path, this rise in consciousness. But consciousness itself is somewhat of an airy topic. Unless we bring this topic down to earth and make it important in our daily lives, I don't think we're going to get much out of it. And before I introduce today's guest, I like to say here that these two topics, consciousness and our own bodies, have a lot in common. Everyone at some point in their life has tried to lose weight, and everyone at some point in their life has searched for God. Now, today's guest, Shannon McEwen of Austin, Texas, has done just that. She has managed to connect consciousness and food. She's the author of a new book published by Kima Global out of South Africa entitled Food Consciousness, A Food Relationship Revolution. And Shannon is well qualified on this topic, by the way. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in foods and nutrition and is professionally credentialed as a licensed dietitian and nutritionist. As we shall see, she's breaking new ground by including in her nutritional counseling consciousness or God. She believes that your relationship with God and your God self affect every other relationship, including your relationship with food. She lives in Austin, Texas, as I said, where her family resides, volunteers for local farmers markets, and practices what she preached. Welcome to the show, Shannon. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Phil. That was a well thought out introduction. Hear, hear.
Well, I like to make it clear that we do have a big problem in this country with obesity, and I think it's important for us in this area of consciousness and new consciousness. Man, I look on my bookshelf, and there's so many books where the word consciousness is coming up, but we need to make it real in our lives. Now let's get started right off the bat here, and maybe you could help us understand what consciousness in your mind has to do with food.
Well, according to my academics, nothing. um, it's interesting that we've been taught evidence-based approaches, evidence-based intervention, but nowhere in that conversation is about the consciousness and the relationship of those two things. So to answer your question, giving my definition is like asking 5 different people, what their definition of love is. Everybody probably explains what consciousness is, in a very different way. But I think you hit upon some really great points in the introduction of what that is, and I tend to agree with your definition, is that it's when we see or find ourselves in a place through certain practices where we honestly reveal and express our true self, our God nature. And through our thoughts and our beliefs, which then manifest itself then in choice and action, those things are then going to either raise our consciousness, or those things are going to keep us, at a certain level, and then of course, it can go downward as well. So I think that, when people use words like they go to their center, when you hear people use words like meditation, visualization, being in the silence, these are all things I think that most people, when they talk about consciousness, would say that they raise their level of consciousness through these kinds of practices. So there's your answer.
well, consciousness itself has this connotation or additional meaning of being a greater awareness. I mean, consciousness itself is a really hard to define term, and I think that there's so many books out there or magazine titles that talk about consciousness explained, the book by Daniel Dennett, and then there's a recent recent issue of Veritas magazine, one of my favorites. The cover story is called "The Origins of Consciousness," and it's such an intriguing topic. But I think the important thing and what you bring to the table, and sorry for this sort of play on words here, is the connection to food, and how did you make the connection between consciousness and food?
Well, kind of again going back to how I started to answer the last question, is that academically I've been trained a certain way to counsel people based on these evidence-based interventions and whatnot, and research and so on and so forth. And, after 20 years of being out in the field working with diabetics and people, who mostly my experience has been with weight management, wellness, and then diabetes kind of started as an influence during my career. And when I spent time counseling people using what I was learning academically and kind of, throwing in my own little loop, if you will, I still saw a cycle of course, people would kind of do well for a little while, and then, but it wasn't sustainable. That was the meat, if you will, Philip.
Right.
It wasn't sustainable. Yep. So it was a funny thing during my master's degree. I just posed a question to the universe, and I said, because as you said at the top of this introduction, is obesity is an overwhelming problem globally and in this country, and it's not only why I chose to get 2 degrees in nutrition. It's a very important subject in this country, and it's also just draining our healthcare system. So when I posed the question to the universe, what's the missing link? Truly, I was downloaded with the title of the book, and things just started coming into me. And I started recording on a digital recorder.
Wow.
And what you have in front of you is a lot of those answers.
Yeah, and I had...
It made so much sense to me, though, when I got the
yes.
download, you know?
Yeah, well, that's what happens when something it happened to me too, and it builds up, and then it's got to come out. And I think another way to put it is, I think it's called inspiration. By the way, I think
Exactly.
what inspiration is, and it sort of builds up. And I like to say that everybody has a book in them. It's unbelievable. Even
Right.
people on the street, everybody, and it's like everybody has a story to tell
That is so true.
that is inside of them. And I counsel people, and most of them don't listen to me, but I counsel people to say, tell them, get it out, just write
Right.
it out and start. And it's like everybody needs to do it. Going back to the diet issue and the obesity, to me, and I said in the beginning that everybody has been on a diet. I think that's probably a universal statement at some point in their lives, and the one sort of a piece of advice that I think is probably one of the top 10 most true pieces of advice on diets is you need to change your lifestyle. And I
Right.
think that a lot of people, they don't change their lifestyle. It's the same thing where they sit in front of a TV set, they sit at their desk at work, they go through, they take the elevators instead of the stairs, and all these kinds of things. But you've sort of taken to another level, and this is why I'm doing this, because if you have a more conscious based life, and we could call it a more spiritual based life, well, that sounds to me like one heck of a good change in lifestyle. That
Correct.
that that sounds like you're getting in tune with something. So
Correct.
I like you to talk about a little bit about how you think the consciousness or the food consciousness style sort of addresses the biggest problem with diets, and you've already mentioned it, which is that people tend to go off of them, or they tend to
Right.
fail
Not
after a couple
sustainable.
weeks, right? Unsustainable. Why don't
Right.
you talk about a little bit about how your approach addresses that problem?
Well, first and foremost, I have to say that when you're getting your nutrition information from an actual nutrition expert, that sort of helps. So
instead of
that's
instead of
on
Suzanne
the
Summers, yeah,
non-conscious side
yeah,
of the story. But I think I kind of have, it's a multifaceted answer to your question. And I think the last thing that I want to address in your question is really kind of the kicker in all of this. But I think one of the things that I offer, and I think I saw in other diet books, is that there's this obsession going on within the book of weighing, weight loss. I mean, it just goes, it's a thread that repeats itself over and over and over again throughout these books. And I think in my book, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to focus people in a positive direction and moving in a forward direction, instead of saying, well, how did you get here, and getting in all the minutia of all of that. Rather, I'm saying, okay, here's where we are, and instead of obsessing on all of the weight weighing and all that stuff and going over and over it, like a bad tape, is we're going to say, here we are. Now, this is where we start. This is where we go. And it starts with going inward. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think I say, and kind of in the beginning of the book, that the book is steeped in epigenetic theory, which is something that Dr. Bruce Lipton has generously gave a lot of his time and research and energy towards. And how I bring forth the epigenetic theory is not by listing empirical research or empirical evidence. What I'm trying to do is through spiritual guidance and healing techniques that are rooted in epigenetic theory. This is kind of how we start the inner process, and the deep contemplation comes in. So, and this was kind of the part of the book where I sort of had a struggle with which direction I was going to go, and I really felt it was important for my first book to be pure inner contemplation practices. There's probably going to be some people who pick up this book and have never meditated before, And at the end of chapters, I don't have exercises or explanations or applications, for them to, do at the ends of chapters. I'm really just asking people to really sit with themselves and their inner self and see where they go with the framework that I give them. So that's kind of the other thing. And I think also, and you touched on this, a little earlier, is that I'm taking this food approach from a holistic point of view where I'm involving the body, the mind, and the soul. But the last thing is I think what really, really makes my book totally different from a lot is that most of Americans especially, they go to the Jenny Craig's and they do the grapefruit diet and so on and so forth because they want a spoon-fed program. The least amount of effort is what they choose to direct themselves towards to, have an outcome that they hope, is going to be sustainable. But what I ask people to do in my book, towards the very end of the chapter, and this could be where people get at the end of the book and they just set it down. They go, well, gosh, that was nice up until now. But I ask them to take ownership and responsibility for their outcome and create their own eating plan. I give them a framework, and then I say, you know you better than I know you. And I've asked you throughout this book to get in tune with your body's wisdom. And hopefully you've got a grain of salt there to work with. Maybe you've got a handful of stuff to work with. So now with what I'm providing you, let's get creative. Let's have you take ownership of this. Because if they take ownership for it, Philip, then they're more likely to make it something they're going to do for the rest of their lives. And here's where the sustainability comes in. So that's really kind of the main
good
point that truly set off unique features of how I'm approaching this, not only from the consciousness point of view, but just, I've done this stuff for 20 years.
Yeah, well, I think it helps that you, as I said at the beginning, you are well qualified. You're not just somebody who's lost weight or been on a diet, and therefore you're going to write a book about how you did it.
Right.
And I think that brings a lot of weight to what you're saying in your book. But I want to make sure we define a term that you used, epigenetics, which a lot of people may not know about. And by the way, Bruce Lipton is going to be the guest next week. I think I mentioned that, but he's
wow.
So ironically, that's one reason we're doing this.
What's the date so I can tune in?
It's going to be whatever the second week of November is. November.
Okay.
He'll be
Great.
November 5th. His show will be available. Now, epigenetics. Why don't you tell the listener what epigenetics is in your mind?
Okay. I'm going to say the simplest form of it, and then I'm going to come back around and kind of explain it a little bit more. It's simply that from our thoughts flow our beliefs. From our beliefs then flow our manifestation of that, which is our choices and actions. Now, everybody's going to kind of sit there and go, that's a really nice little quote that I can put to use. But it's not the kind of thing that you work with on a surface level. And Dr. Lipton believes and has shown through many of his research studies that our health is not controlled by our genetics.
Right.
So in order for this simple theory that I just said to you to actually work, he asks us to go deep into connecting with our God self, to surface our subconscious programs and old tapes and bring about new beliefs. And when we get down into that deep subconscious level, our body's biology will behave to fit that new belief. And as we go through that process, we start disconnecting from the tribal mind and all the socially conditioned things that have got people on the cycles of dieting over and over, and bad health to begin with. So it sounds like something easy enough, but it's not meant for just superficial surface thinking or surface thought. I mean, you can sit there all you want and have a mantra of from my beliefs, from my thoughts flow my beliefs, from my beliefs flow my actions. And you can chant that hundreds of thousands of times.
Right.
But if you're not taking that chant and getting down inward into the subconscious level, then you, according to Dr. Lipton, you don't stand a chance of it affecting your DNA and thus, bringing about true health that your genetics really have little to do with.
Yeah, and I tell you what excites me about epigenetics is that for those who follow this area, there's a couple of books by Richard Dawkins, and I think his most famous book is called The Selfish Gene. And in that book, Richard Dawkins says that we are gene machines, and that had a nice ring to it. And of course, Richard Dawkins is a great writer. And by gene machines, what he was saying was that we are controlled by our genes. And he said that, and this is Dawkins, he said that we are survival machines. We have a bunch of genes we're only trying to reproduce and live to the next day and pass on the genes. And that sounds very mechanical. It sounds like there's nothing we can do to improve ourselves. We're stuck with these genes. And I think what you're saying and what Bruce Lipton and others say is that is really false. It's really, we're not controlled by our genes, that the beliefs...
It's very limiting, too.
Right. His beliefs...
And if we are really God nature,
right,
then how can we sit there and limit ourselves in such a narrow space to that kind of thinking?
Right. And that's the connection that I think Bruce Lipton makes and others make, which is that this finding of science, which is that we are not controlled by our genes, that our beliefs affect our genetic makeup or DNA, that is exactly consistent with the spirituality movement, which began about 2,500 years ago, which says that essentially you could be whatever you want to be. That the sky's the limit. That you can't. That whatever your parents told you is not true. That you could break through cultural barriers and physical barriers and everything else. And so it's a very exciting topic. So we had that little segue there into epigenetics, and I think that's very important for folks to understand, particularly in the diet area, where we tend to sort of easily give in to this concept that, well, there's a eating gene or something, or it's in my blood, or it's a disease. I saw a billboard while driving. It's something like obesity is a disease. Come and get help or something. I mean, it sort of implies that you take a drug, just like you said, it's easy. You take a drug and you get all better. You've done a lot of studying on obesity. What do you think are the main factors that have resulted in the obesity epidemic in this country?
Well, that's a really great question. I think the simple answer is that our food chain, our food system is not what it used to be. Food really isn't food any longer. You can pick up any package in the grocery store now, and it has about 15 different things in it. Right. We are just far away. Even interestingly enough, our agricultural system itself, if you go back 50 years, is significantly different than what it was. Now, granted, a lot of people are going to say, well, sure, there's hundreds of millions more people on the earth. We had to kind of catch up with that. But what has happened in making this shift for the masses, be it for the masses or be it for the bottom line, you be the judge of that. But we have went from when we used to give you for an example, for instance, is when apple trees used to be planted for it to show up in our grocery stores 50 years ago. It was not in a monoculture sort of agriculture system. And what I mean by that is now apples are acres and acres and acres of a McIntosh is planted by a particular farmer. And go back 50 years, and we had much smaller planting of apples. And there we might even find McIntosh among Gala, and we might find McIntosh and Gala next to Granny Smith. And so there was a diversity of apples that were being planted together rather than one single apple that's acres and acres and acres of that particular one apple. And that doesn't sound significant in a lot of ways to most people, but what happens is that when we shifted to a monoculture system, and this is not just with apples, we have to now use more pesticides. And you say, well, why do we have to do that? Well, the simple reason is that insects have a much easier time when you're planting acres and acres of one thing for them to find the key, if you will, to the door to infesting your apples. Whereas if you have much smaller crops of apples and you have various apples, here comes the word variety, diversity, then the insects don't have as much of a chance to find that lock and, that key to the lock as quickly. And so thus there doesn't have to be as much pesticides. So something as simple as that is one thing. And now that we were using much more pesticides because we've monocultured a lot of our foods these days, these pesticides are now in our soil, and they're degrading our soil. So, and we're turning over these crops so much faster. So now our soil has lost its minerals, and because it doesn't have time for rebirth,
right, in
a way. So that's just, a small little part of a multifaceted problem of how our food system has changed significantly enough to where, now we haven't even had the discussion about junk food and processed foods and so on and so forth. I was actually talking about real food, and you can see where the problem lies with real food.
Yeah.
So now we throw in, the conversation of junk food and fast food, and just to give you another simple example with what I call a man-made food, let's just talk, for a second about artificial sweeteners. Okay. We've got various choices out there as far as artificial sweeteners go. And a lot of people don't think of high fructose corn syrup as an artificial sweetener, but it is. It's not. High fructose corn syrup is man-made. It doesn't come from nature. So I'm going to go out on a limb and call it an artificial sweetener. But basically what happens is when man makes, first of all, let me say that we all know that artificial sweeteners are much sweeter than their natural counterpart, which is sugar cane.
Right.
Okay? That's the first thing. So first of all, we're creating a new conditioning to our palate, and from our palate to our brain, of hypersweetness. That's the first thing. Second of all, is that as we've created these artificial sweeteners, we've attached some chemicals. Now it's no longer C6H12O6. Now it has, some hydrogens and some chlorides and some other things attached to it. And what we have found, and research is really backing this up pretty good nowadays, is that our bodies, our palate is seeing it hypersweetness. But then when the message goes to our brain and as it's being metabolized, it's hitting a pleasure center in our brain, almost like drugs do. And it's changing the chemistry in our brain now to where just by having artificial sweeteners, we now want more sweets because of that exposure. And then to top that off is not only do we want more sweets, but now our brains are asking for denser calories. In other words, for things that have high calories in them. So almost like a drug addict has their brain chemistry changed because of the chemical structure of opium or the chemical structure of heroin, the same thing is happening with these man-made foods we are creating.
Well, let me stop you right there for 1 minute, and maybe you're going to say this, but what sweetener would you recommend?
Well,
And I'm not saying
anything that is
artificial. I'm saying natural or artificial.
right.
Which
Anything
sweetener?
that is as close to nature as you can get. So, I mean, obviously, none of us are going to go running around chewing on sugar cane, okay? And we're not going to take a sugar cane and stick it down in our tea
Right.
because we won't get the sweetness we want because the husk that is around the sugar cane, is way too thick for us to even get the sweetness we want out of the sugar cane in the first place. So, what I'm trying to tell people here is that you can't use a sugar cane to get your sweetness. We do have to process it. I'm sorry to say, but that's just a condition that's going to happen with us being able to use sugar cane. But the least processing of that is what you want to look for. So a sugar that is maybe organic evaporated cane juice sugar, turbinado sugar. Those are probably sugars that you can use that have the least amount of processing and are still as close to the sugar cane as you can get without having a lot of bleaching, a lot of chemicals, and a lot of other stuff in order to get that processing from cane to a workable product that isn't so far from the sugar cane. It will be, like honey, pure maple syrup. Of course, everybody knows about stevia now. So you would be things along those lines, Philip.
Okay, so if you're in a standard grocery store, and you're looking for the most healthy form of sweetener, what would be your recommendation?
Well, I personally buy organic evaporated cane juice sugar. And the only reason that I suggest people organic is simple because if you don't know enough about organic, just to know this is that the way in which organic farmers have to grow, number one, their soil has more minerals, and secondly, they're not going to be using pesticides. So right there in organic, that is lifting your vibration and your frequency of your food immediately. So that's the only reason that I say organic.
Yeah, and I thought that you said, and also you said something that a lot of us have read, but maybe we never, at least speaking for myself, I've never completed the thought, which is I think you're suggesting that in these artificial sweeteners, such as say Diet Coke or Diet Pepsi, where they are very sweet, and there's different types of artificial sweeteners that are used, and there's literature out there that says, well, the diet drinks aren't good either because they lead to a craving for other sugary foods. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
That's right on the money.
Okay.
And even though, of course, diet drinks are getting, everybody goes, but they're 0 calories.
Right.
Still, I mean, think about it, is if you're drinking something that has this artificial sweetener in it that's changing the chemistry of your brain to want more sweet things, which we know everything that is sweet has a lot of calories in it. There's going to be high in calories. But then it's changing your brain chemistry to just want things that have high calories in them. It doesn't necessarily even now have to be sweet anymore. If anything that has a lot of calories in it, now your brain is wanting and desiring that. So it's really just it's like being hypnotized without being hypnotized.
Yeah.
It's an inner hypnotizing going on. Just simply because of how, like I said, the little C's and the H's and the chlorides and all the things, they do to change the chemistry of an artificial sweetener that does not look anything anymore like the chemistry or the chemical structure of cane sugar. And that's where we're getting into a lot of problems in this country. And just let's go back to, let's not even talk about diet soda. Let's just talk about regular soda. It's high fructose corn syrup.
Right.
It's like I said, most people don't put high fructose corn syrup as an artificial sweetener. I do. Because, like I said, the bottom line is it's man-made. Bottom line is it's hyper sweet.
Right.
So I think, either way, whether you're doing a diet or whether you're doing a regular soda with high fructose corn syrup, you're still doing the same thing. It's just the artificial sweetener in the Diet Coke tends to have a more direct and faster influence than the high fructose corn syrup, at least that we know of right now.
Let's talk a little bit about what your advice would be for somebody that wants to eat more healthy. Now, I want to say that in your book title and in your book itself, the consciousness, it seems to me, part of it is be more conscious of what you're putting into your body. That's sort of
Right.
like one sort of spin off of the conscious part of it. Be more aware, and you give very very good and clear explanations, just like you did right now with the processed food and the movement away from organic food.
Mm-hmm.
So I take it that that's one part of what you're saying to people, but I think but aren't you saying something more than just that? When you use the word consciousness.
Yeah, and there's a place in the book where I grew up in Kansas, although I'm a Texas girl, and probably like a lot of you don't have to be in Kansas to love the Wizard of Oz,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
everybody's very familiar with that story. But I kind of say that once our collective consciousness wakes up and realizes that the answers to our health and our weight loss problems are not outside of ourselves, with portion control and calorie counting, fake foods that you can buy from Nutrisystem, this realization is that should kind of come out of all this, and then I bring about in the book, is that there's a beginning of the journey, just like Dorothy started following the yellow brick road. And just like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, she always had the ruby red slippers to get her home. And all of us have always had our God center, and our God self is always there. It's just some of us are more connected to it and awakened to it, and others of us, have to be introduced to that, if you will.
Yes.
And the obesity epidemic can be eliminated, I believe, once every single one of us embraces our body temples, because you're going to treat it that way if that's how you look at it. And this involves an inner process of identifying your food relationships, clearing those emotional centers so that you find your body asking for God's perfect nutrition, which is Mother Nature's bounty. So I like to use the Wizard of Oz as an analogy of, everybody knows the story of, she had her way to get home all along, but, she had to make the journey, and, she always had it with her. I mean, that's the bottom line. She always had it with her. And I think this is kind of, why when you asked me kind of at the top of this conversation is, how consciousness, fits into this whole thing, is that this is why over 20 years that I've been giving nutritional counseling to people, that I've seen the same cycle repeat itself, is because, everybody's looking at the Wizard of Oz for their answers, which is Nutrisystem and the grapefruit diet and so on and so forth. And until people come back within and they really embrace with every fabric of their being that their body is a temple, and in that dwells the Holy Spirit, then once you get to that place and start using some of the spiritual practices and clearing those emotional attachments that we have with our relationship with food, then, you can sit there and do Nutrisystem over and over and over again. I truly believe that through this way, we're looking at really finally having something sustainable.
Yeah. Now let me put another spin on this, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, and that is getting back to one of the themes in the show, which is a rise in consciousness. We've had a couple people on the show who talk about that we're really spirits in a spiritual world, or spirits having a physical experience.
Right.
And there is a rise in awareness when a person appreciates that there's a greater power, a greater unity to the world than meets the eye, when we stop thinking of ourselves as cogs in a big machine, but as part of a united whole. And
Right.
I happen to think that this rise in consciousness, this greater awareness of who we are, also leads to a greater awareness of the miracle that is life. And
Right.
that to me leads to that the body is a temple, and you have to respect it,
Right.
and it becomes, and so it's really not anything that is different than the great religious traditions. And I say this a lot. It's not as if we and even I sort of woke up one day and had this amazing idea about, well,
Right.
everybody should be more spiritual. This is coming out of the great religious texts. We're just trying to bring them up to date and give them more meaning. And
Correct.
I saw in your book where you quoted the temple as a body, or the body as a temple passage in the, I believe it's the New Testament. I thought that really was important, because it drew the connection between sort of the religious spiritual traditions and something as mundane as a diet. And it is a really important connection to make. And
Right.
so I think that is the other form of the consciousness that I was driving at. It's not just be conscious of what you eat, which is important, but if you look inside and you understand more honestly and more complete what we really are, it makes you
Right.
appreciate that you sort of have to take care of yourself a little bit. Um, I want to now move into some bigger issues, which is that, does eating in the nature of food consciousness help people with maybe like heart disease, high blood pressure, cholesterol, these kinds of things? I mean, how far can you take this?
Well, let me kind of explain to you this way. Is I did my thesis on superfruits, and one of the reasons that I decided on superfruits was because of a personal experience that I had with a superfruit, and it happened to be goji juice. And what had happened, and this was before I started my master's degree and did, my thesis on the superfruits and whatnot, is I had a kitty cat that had a cancer. She had a little bump on her head. And, of course, they were telling me that I should do chemo and radiation on her. And I was not about to have that. And interestingly enough, in the next 3 weeks after she got this diagnosis, I just happened to be in conversation or around people who were talking about goji juice. Didn't know anything about it. Started looking into it and decided that from what I could see with what I was turning up, it was worth looking into. So I bought some goji juice, started putting it in my cat's water, and within a month, Philip, the bump went away. Granted, I don't even think I was buying a really pure, strong goji juice product at the time, but I mean, this is what I was noticing after doing it. And then the other thing was, she's a 15-year-old cat. She started acting like she was 7 years old again. And what ended up happening is, at some point in time, she refused the goji juice in her water. She just wanted water. And within about a month, the bump came back, and I lost her not long after that. But what I learned through writing my thesis is the therapeutic value in these kinds of foods. Without me even knowing it, I refused the chemotherapy and the radiation, but I was giving her natural chemotherapy through the goji juice. So intuitively, I was led to what she needed naturally. And this whole story of what I'm telling you is leading back to how you asked me, is that when people switch, let's just visualize an hourglass, if you will, and take that hourglass and say, okay, this is the standard American diet. Flip it upside down and say, now this is a plant-based eating plan. And as soon as you flip that hourglass and you make what used to be the standard American diet the opposite of that, which would then be plants,
Right.
you're not going to have issues. You're not going to have conversations about heart disease. You're not going to have conversations about cancer. You're not going to have conversations about diabetes and kidney disease and digestive issues and so on and so forth. Because the whole way that a plant grows, survives, and feeds itself, when we eat that, we benefit from every living part of that. And the problem is the standard American diet doesn't have enough of those nutrients and qualities to really almost literally save our lives, because we're too busy eating meats and chicken and turkey and processed foods and McDonald's and sugary drinks, and once we get filled with that stuff, we don't have room for the good stuff.
Yeah. Now let me just tell you what a natural response to this would be, and there's two common responses. The first one's going to be, and you briefly touched on it, is going to be, I don't have time. I don't have time to do it right. I don't have time to go to the Whole Foods supermarket and the farmers markets. and to buy the right things. I have too much. So what's your response to that?
Well, normally when I used to counsel diabetics, and I used to actually have a lot of compassion for them, that they were going to have to change their eating plans so drastically to accommodate, their glucose issues, and whatnot. And now, I just, only a year ago, Philip, did I switch to going gluten-free. And then not long after going gluten-free, then I went on a plant-based diet, mostly plant-based diet. And all my digestive issues went away. And I would have said, when I was asking the diabetes people to make their changes in their diet when they found that they had diabetes, I had compassion. I was like going, this is going to be a real restructuring for you. And when I decided, or I felt that my body was asking to have the gluten-free and the plant-based, and I did it, I would have thought that had I not had the experience myself and I was counseling people to do this, that I would have been sitting here and saying, it really is hard. It's restrictive. It's not the easiest thing to do. And I'm sorry, I can't say that to you. This is not my experience. I've been doing this now for a year. It sounds, I think what you're trying to bring forth in your question is that people in their minds think it's going to be difficult, that, even if you don't have a Whole Foods in your city, you don't need one. All you need to do is, once you start learning some of the critical factors that I teach in the second half of my book on things like monoculture, if I can give you one example,
Sure.
is I tell people about, in my regular grocery store, I have the choice of a Dole banana, a Del Monte banana, and then some other banana was there, and I looked at it, and it's a banana that comes out of Guatemala. And I try to teach people that, if you can buy your produce or your plant food as close to your source as possible, that's the best thing. So, if you have a farmer's market and you can do that, that's a really great thing to be able to do. But if you don't have that availability, and here I am at my local grocery store, and I have these three choices, my first thing I teach people is, if I'm looking at a label that says Del Monte or Dole, I can pretty much guarantee you that they are monoculturing these bananas. So even if they're monocultured here in the United States, I'm going to be getting bananas that are having lots of pesticide on them and a soil that is not mineral rich. On the other hand, if I choose the Guatemalan banana, certainly it's coming from a lot further, granted, but the Guatemalan banana is probably, and I will almost guarantee this too, it's being grown in smaller crops. It is probably being grown at a elevation and mineral-rich soil compared to what we would have here in the United States. So even if it has to make the distance to the United States, just the atmosphere, the soil, the fact that they're probably growing the banana in a small crop is making that banana the better choice. So I don't have to have whole foods, to make those kind of choices. And it really is what I'm trying to do in my book, is educate people on these simple kinds of things. And certainly I say it's simple, but this is going to be an education process for them, and it's going to be a learning curve at first. But once you get a handle on these things, you can go to your local grocery store. You don't need a Whole Foods in order to be able to do exactly what I just told you to do.
Well,
and you can do that with a lot of food.
Right. Well, you also, that's also consistent with what you said earlier about giving people a framework, educating people about how foods are made,
Right.
the whole concept of processed food, the food chain, and give people the ability to make their own decisions,
Exactly.
as opposed to going to the store and getting the Jenny Craig box or
Right.
or the pre-made dietary frozen dinner or something, and because that is a lifestyle change, that is an educated change. I like to think,
It's
to
a consciousness change too, though, Philip.
Exactly.
Which is like you said earlier, is that we've been sitting here talking lifestyle through calorie counting and portion control, and you just need to do this, you just need to do that, and lifestyle in and of itself is not going to get you anywhere.
Right.
It's that awareness, that consciousness, that shift of what my nature is, and then finding that when you get in that place, your body's going to be asking for something it never asked for before, and when you decide you're going to make this change, it just comes so easily because you're in the sweet spot.
Right. Yeah.
You're in the sweet spot.
Well, I have to put it this way: there are so many diets, and there's so many. It seems as if the diet of the day or the diet book of
Right.
the year, and they seem, and you indicate that many of them do work in the short term. And as someone once said, well, if you follow any diet, it's bound to work. It's the problem
Right.
is sustaining it. But once if you change your mindset or your consciousness, then that becomes a spiritual change, and therefore you approach food in a different way. And I think that a lot of this that you're saying makes a lot of sense. And in fact, that's sort of the way I do it. Now, I am not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think having a greater awareness of yourself and your potential and spirituality and who we really are, it leads to a greater respect for yourself.
Right.
Now there's one more sort of question that is sort of a popular kind of a topic, because a lot of people take supplements, and
Right.
and why don't you just say a couple things about what your views are about whether supplements are actually any good?
Okay. Well, like a lot of things in our society, particularly here in America, we've been socialized in accepting the information given to us by the supplement industry is that isolated nutrients, like you can go and buy a bottle of lycopene, in a bottle. You can go and buy a bottle of lutein. But both of these things are found, like lycopene is found in tomatoes, lutein is found in kale. And what the supplement industry is trying to tell us is that if you buy that lycopene in their bottle, that it's going to bring about the same health changes that is if you ate the tomato.
Right.
And the reason they're telling us that is because we do know, in fact, that the lycopene is the God ingredient, if you will, that has the effect on the health therapeutic effect. It is the lycopene that carries that vibration the most. But what the supplement industry isn't telling us is that it's the lycopene with all the other things that a tomato has. It's that matrix
Right.
of everything working together, that unity of nutrients that really makes the health benefit that lycopene actually offers. But for them to just pull out just the lycopene and say, oh, this is going to give you the health benefit that you're looking for, we're completely being having the wool pulled over our eyes.
Yeah.
And so until the supplement industry starts manufacturing tomato supplements, you're really just better off with the real thing.
Yeah.
And but I do have a few supplements, and I do say this in my book, is I really truly believe, Philip, that when you're eating a mostly plant-based diet, or eating plan, as I like to refer to it, I think diet to me is a word that marketers came up with. So I don't like to use it, and usually when we use the word diet, we think of something that is cyclical and short-term. So I like to use the phrase eating plan. But some of the supplements that I really do kind of like are things that you couldn't ordinarily go into your grocery store or down to the farmer's market and get these things. And one of the things is just, the story I told you earlier about goji berries.
Right.
The superfruits are wonderful, wonderful additions to even a very good, well-rounded plant-based diet. But some other ones that I like are chlorella and spirulina, which these are both algae. And then there's some people hear the word maca rolling around in certain circles. Well, I like root macas. Even though we do eat some tubers, things that grow, under the ground, we've really, as a country, gotten away from that. And interesting enough, anything that grows above the ground, of course, goes through photosynthesis and chlorophyll and all those really great things. But believe it or not, there's a whole, it's just like the life force of birds and stuff that are, up here in the atmosphere with us are quite different than marine life. It's two completely different systems. And so it's the same thing with the root foods, is because they're underground, they bring forth nutrients that we wouldn't ordinarily get, because the ones that are growing above ground have a whole different system to them. And one of the other things I really like is living clay. So these would be things that I would say normally you're not going to find in your produce department. These particular nutrients have some really great qualities to them, nutrient-wise, that you wouldn't be able to get otherwise. And I think that these are something that's welcoming to supplement, because you're not doing it because you need to. You're doing it as an adjunct or an addition to something really good that you're already doing. Now you're just amplifying it.
That's a good way to end this conversation, to supplement it in the right way, and that's why I want to do that. Well, I want to thank you for your time, and why don't you let listeners know how to get in touch with either you and buy your book?
Okay, they can go to www.mindurfood.com, and that's mindurfood.com. And if you buy the book on my website, it's the only place that you'll be able to get an autographed copy and free shipping. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Google Books and other places as well. But like I said, the only place you can get the free shipping and an autographed copy is from my website. My blog you will also find on my website, as well as my email to be able to contact me if you have any further questions or conversation that you would like to have with me. So there you have it, Phil.
Well, that's great, and I'd like to thank you for being with us. And the one thing that I want to emphasize here is that food and consciousness do go together. That this is bringing these concepts of spirituality down to earth, making us more aware of who we are, our own bodies, and to pay more attention to what goes into our bodies.
Right.
Getting in touch with nature
Right.
is good, and it not only leads to a more healthy lifestyle, but it may ward off diseases, make us feel better about ourselves, and treat our bodies as the temples that they really are. This is Philip Merton. This is Conversations Beyond Science and Religion. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Conversations Beyond Science and Religion with Philip Meriton. To find out more about Philip and his new book, The Heaven at the End of Science, visit heavenattheendofscience.com.